Patchouli. So this video has been a long time coming. Last fall, winter, I feel like I really went down a patchouli rabbit hole and been thinking of making a video about it ever since. But here we are 1 year later. Especially lately, I feel like I tend to get really interested in a particular note and I seek out different iterations, find the different versions of that note and the way that different houses and noses treat that. I'm feeling this winter, I've really been more into incense lately, but I still love patchouli, and so we'll talk about some here. One of the things that I think makes patchouli such a magical note is, as I've heard, it's a relatively inexpensive ingredient, but it really has great longevity. It works fantastic as a base that just goes on and on forever, and I find a long-lasting patchouli dry down to be a really satisfying kind of wear experience. My favorite style of patchouli tends to be more camphorous and sort of like wet, earthy. The kind of patchouli I tend not to like as much is very dry and dusty, as if you can imagine the dry leaves crumbling in your hands. To me, that approach or that style, that's what reminds me more of the sort of classic hippie patchouli oil, whereas the wet camphorous style really doesn't go there for me. So we'll start with one of the newest to my collection and also the lightest, and we'll work up to the heavy boys. Perfumer H Patchouli. In my previous reviews of her line, I had said that I find the most interesting ones are where they're dealing with ingredients that otherwise would be very heavy, because Perfumer H Lynn Harris tends to have a very light touch, which is good or bad depending on what you want out of a perfume. After having tried several, I start to feel the redundancy, and I feel happy with the few that I have and not so inclined to continue to explore further. But I thought patchouli being such a heavy note would be really interesting in her hands. What's nice about this is it also cites galbanum and several other notes. And in fact, I don't get much patchouli at all up front. And it is, in Perfumer H style, very, very light wearing. And I was almost disappointed when I first bought it. I kept spraying, wanting for more several times throughout the day. But then I found, actually it was this morning, after spraying on several reapplications yesterday, that I woke up with a really beautiful, like warm, glowy kind of that camphorous, wet, fresh patchouli smell. So it's there, but it took a while to come out. But very, very light performance. But if you like the idea of something like a patchouli cologne almost, then give this one a try. Coming up, let's see what else is lighter. This isn't exactly light, but maybe a little light on the patchouli smell. Austin's Impression Patchouli Heart #1. This one to me is really all about, at the beginning, these herbs and labdanum. Again, I haven't smelled individual materials. I'm not a perfumer or really a materials nerd, so I'm sure that patchouli plays a big role, but it doesn't smell like any patchouli I know. I know they use a lot of their ingredients from LMR. In fact, it says right there. So maybe it's been fractionated, maybe some aspects they don't like have been taken out. I'm sure it plays a role, as it does have this sort of earthy fall-like wet leaves. But to me, yeah, the dry down is all about this really beautiful, warm, sort of almost soapy, fresh, camphorous labdanum with a huge, really herbaceous top note. Almost reminds me of Thanksgiving dinner or the smell of stuffing with all the herbs you put in stuffing. But it's a really great wear, but not necessarily the first thing I think of when I think of the smell of patchouli. Moving on, this one I talked about, it was a surprise love and hit for me, and I'm still enjoying it. This is Patch from Anne Fragrances. Unfortunately, this was the first one I tried, and it got me really excited about the brand, and so I got the Discovery set, and I can still say I didn't like anything else from the brand. But this really amps up the fizzy, camphorous qualities of patchouli, and it really has that sort of Coca-Cola vibe that people have discussed in other perfumes like Roja's Creation E. But again, the dry down is so lovely. They also reference that there's some oud in this, and it does have this really nice, warm, woody dry down, but it never goes too dark. Again, that sort of camphoraceous, wet earth vibe, sort of like a cool, misty morning and fall, sustains throughout. But such a really invigorating and interesting opening. And I can say, I believe they say this in the ad copy too, that it's one of the most unique patchoulis I've smelled. Yeah, right away just smelling off. Very medicinal though, so if you don't like medicinal side of patchouli, then you may not like this. But moving on, again, you'll notice a theme in the patchoulis I've got. Serge Lutens, Borneo. For many people, the reference patchouli. Again, what I love about this is it's also mixed with galbanum, which gives sort of a green, lighter freshness to it, which keeps it out of that dank, dusty area. Yeah, I can see why it's a reference patchouli, and that is just right down the middle, kind of perfectly balanced, perfectly everything. There's cocoa as well, which lends this sort of semi-sweet, but not really sweet, but it feels a little sweet next to these two, vibe to it, and this like dusty coziness. Often compared to Coromandel, I would say you could call them cousins, but not twins by any means. This is a lot drier. It's lacking that sort of warm, sweet amber that's at the heart of Coromandel that some people also read as chocolate. But really beautiful. I can completely understand why it's a reference, because it feels like it shoots straight down the middle and is just really perfectly balanced in every way and a super satisfying wear. Like a lot of Serge Lutens I've experienced, it has a big blast at the opening, but fairly quickly dries down to something quite a lot more quiet and elegant, and therefore pretty easy to wear, not as challenging as you might expect from Lutens. But yeah, if you were to have like one signature scent patchouli, I could definitely see Borneo being it. Moving up the ladder, and Dimmelmeister A Perfume. Now this kind of goes down the style of patchouli that I'm not the huge fan of, because it feels very dry and it feels very spicy. I had compared this in my review, and I was going out on a limb because I was, I believe, the first to review it and talk about it, as it's not that easy to get your nose on unless you're in Belgium. And I compared it to Antaeus, and I feel vindicated to look on Fragrantica. The number one smells like is Antaeus. I don't know if people are watching me. Do I have that much influence? No, I don't think so. But to me, it really, clutch your purses, boys and girls. It smells like what I imagine an Antaeus extrait would smell like. So if that sounds good to you, you really need to seek this out. I remember towards the end of last winter, some of the small boutiques that carry Anne Dimmelmeister, such as Atelier New York and H. Lorenzo, had marked this down with seasonal sales to quite a nice price. So it is expensive, but it is a parfum concentration. It's very oily and strong, but it has quite a lot of patchouli of the sort of dusty kind. But I think what takes it also in that slightly more old-fashioned is it feels like it has some kind of like castoreum type smell, although it's not listed, but it gives me that, with also that old-fashioned mix of sort of soapy clean with something sort of dirty spicy. So I really get that. So it does have a bright camphoraceousness to it as well, but yeah, it gets quite spicy and soapy feeling to me, and you get that sort of, yeah, dusty, almost hippie patchouli, but I think it's a perfect smell when you imagine the Anne Dimmelmeister man. Coming up next, something, well, actually in terms of heaviness, we'll go with this next. Cartier L'Heure 12, L'Heure Mystérieux. This one is all about sort of a dank patchouli, but it's also very strange. To me, it has sort of an old, dusky, I think it's jasmine giving this. It doesn't smell, for the longest time I had trouble detecting the jasmine, but now I believe it's the jasmine indels that give this kind of strange, eerie, otherworldly creaminess to it. I've always imagined like a leather jacket in a musky basement, but as nasty as that sounds, Mathilde always kind of polishes things to a high gloss, so at the same time it smells quite refined. I also get almost a chocolatey cacao kind of note out of it. Again, I would say actually it beats this in terms of strangest patchouli that I've smelled. I could see this being very, as they say, Marmite, love it or hate it, so not a safe blind buy, as it's a fairly strange smell. But if you like it, you're really gonna like it, and I don't think you're gonna find anything else similar. Oh gosh, I pulled quite a few more than I realized. The Icon, what needs to be said about this? it's the kind of fragrance that when I spray it, I just think, why do I have anything else? Why do I wear anything else? Chanel Coromandel, all the good things that have been said about it still aren't enough to describe how wonderful this fragrance is. I've got the Parfum here, and I've also got the EDT. Biggest difference to me about the Parfum is it's actually more patchouli, and the patchouli is quite a bit dirtier, which is really interesting and surprising coming from Chanel. It's more earthy and dirty, a little bit less of the sweet, ambery, white chocolatiness of the EDP. So it depends on what you're looking for. I'd say they're both quite similar, but I actually have come around to prefer the Parfum because I liked the kind of toned down sweet amberness and the toned up patchouliness of it. And I just love the way the Parfums wear because I don't like to wear scents that blast people out around me. The Parfums, you put a dab on, and unlike most perfumes, or let's say an EDT or a cologne, where the best part's in the beginning and then it kind of tapers off, with Parfums, I tend to find the best part is like 6 hours later. So the beginning, it takes a little while to get going because it's so dense, but as you wear it, it just gets better and better and better and grows on you. And that's such a wonderful wearing experience. Next up, while we're on the topic of icons, Amen. This is one I had struggled whether to purchase or not because I don't particularly like sweet fragrances. I'd heard its reputation. I don't particularly like vintage smelling fragrances that are overly of its time, but I found a really fantastic deal, I think $40 on FragBuy, and they had put in parentheses semi-vintage. So I bought it, and I'm reliably told by our friend Rich Mitch that this is the good stuff because it says Thierry Mugler on the bottom and not just Mugler. I wore it the other day and I smelled like a damn caramel. It really is sweet. The sweetness to my nose kind of batters out the patchouli, but I can really imagine how the patchouli is playing a role to give that sweetness a bit of depth, as the caramel feels like that dark, deep, sort of almost burnt caramel that has, more depth and earthiness to it than like a super sweet, light, milky caramel. It was a nice wear. I can say not my favorite, but for the money I spent, I'm quite happy to have it. And I think in really cold weather, that sweetness is going to be very appreciated, that sweetness and warmth. So I look forward to wearing it more. On the other end of not sweet whatsoever is Monsieur. I can remember trying this when it came out and I was like, holy cow, this is way too masculine for me. This is way too like rugged and loud. But I had since worn it several times and I've really come along to enjoy it. The opening is really amazing, this amazing boozy, rummy opening. But again, I find that the way it wears, there's air in it. There's a transparency. As rough and loud as it is, it doesn't feel dense and thick, like you can see through it. Now, it does smell like there's a fair amount of kind of woody ambers giving that lift and that airiness, but I think it's really well judged, really bold. It also, because of that, smells very refined. I remember the ad imagery of like a suited man's sleeve. I think it really matches that nicely. Again, if you're really sensitive to woody ambers, which I usually am, I can see the criticism towards this one being a bit rough, a bit dry and scratchy, but I really enjoyed wearing it. I actually haven't worn it yet this season because it's hardly gotten cold yet, but I've really come around to this one. And last up, probably in the heaviest, is Perfume Aroma Patchouli. Again, what I like, it has that camphorous side, it goes chocolatey. Like all Perfume Aroma, it's super oily and feels really heavy and thick, but you can kind of rub it around and get some distribution. This, I think, if you want chocolatey, heavy, dense patchouli, can also be seen as a reference. Many of Perfume Aroma's single note perfumes kind of are a great reference for that note because they don't do a whole lot else, but what they do with that note is really wonderful, incredibly long lasting, and quite a nice satisfying wear. So let's decide, what should I actually wear today? You know, I feel like wearing Monsieur because I haven't worn it yet since it's gotten cold. So here we go. One spray for now, do some more later. Yeah, it's like almost like leathery, rubbery, alcoholic. Yeah, very dense. This is very dark. This is probably the darkest smelling patchouli I would think out of these. Can I say that about any others? No, that's it. So there's several patchoulis that I have and some of my thoughts on them, and I hope you enjoy wearing your patchouli this fall and winter.